it is about seasons, definitely. It's about seasons, it's about cities, and it's about longing and love, but it's also about a larger context and history, I think, which is why the word politics is there, because in my book, I think the personal and the political come together through the protagonist, through the narrator, the first person narrator, who we meet over a decade. And as you see the decade progressing, I mean, how do you divide a decade? You divide it by virtue of months, years, events. So to me, the decade is about seasons. And in a way, it moves from Calcutta, Delhi. It starts with spring in Calcutta, and then it moves to Delhi. And it comes back and forth between Calcutta, Delhi, and then there's Mumbai, which is where you see the monsoon, because where else do you see monsoon in India but Mumbai? Of course, in Calcutta is where you do see. And then it goes to Edinburgh, where you see fall, which is which is a very particular season in the West. And of course, you see autumn in Delhi, and again winter. So a decade, for me, the strategy to look at a decade in a person's life is through seasons, and each city in a way is representing that moment. And love, longing, and politics, all of this is also like seasonal, I think. And that's how I feel that it sort of encapsulates the book.
Well, the seasons do have quite a strong presence. They're described, they're entered into. And the thing with seasons, of course, is that they've always been deeply emotional and also symbolic. I mean, if you look back at our history of poetry and writing, music, art, it's the seasons of nature that inflect them and give them so much of their color and magic. Summer stands for something, spring stands for something, fall stands for something, and different people can have different emotional relationships. Like when we think of the anxious waiting for rain and the way, people respond to the first rain. So the anchoring change and anchoring emotional growth, in a sense, in seasons is I think a very human and very viable thing to do. So you talked about the fact that this book has been set over a decade. And one of the things that I feel is important about this book is that, in a sense, it is a kind of a coming of age or Bildungsroman book. The protagonist, when she starts, when we meet her right at the beginning, is very, very different from the person she is 10 years later. And the kind of explorations she's made and the choices that she's made to lead her life in a certain way are also what the book is about. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that choice as a writer.
Yeah. It's a decade is strangely, it's short as well as long. And there's so much which you undergo in a decade, but when you look back, then you almost feel that it was like a blink of an eye. So it was very difficult. I mean, as a writer, I thought that one thing that I remember thinking when I started the writing was that I knew that passage of time was very important. I knew that, from 25 to 35, so we see a protagonist who we begin at 25, she's around 25, 26 years old. It's her first job, she's trying to do a PhD, she's almost a reluctant teacher, and she's a temporary teacher. So, and we know that temporary teachers are just so sort of dispensable, like nobody really cares about them, but they are providing very vital knowledge in the university space. So she's a temporary teacher, and she's not even sure whether she wants to commit to this kind of a life. And to see her grow, you have to give her time, and that is what I try to do. And there are certain choices which are not necessarily the right choices which she takes, but all her choices are driven by the fact that she wants to be a writer. But she wants to be a writer coming from a very ordinary middle class background. Now that's not easy, we know that. You need a certain amount of cultural capital in a country like India particularly, where to make a choice like a writer, like being a writer, to not have to earn money. And that question of class and money and earning and livelihood And choice is something which she grapples with over a decade. And for that, she makes certain decisions which are, and the decade is also about love between the two men that she meets, Nikhil and Zaf actually. And through that, you also see her choices, you see her moral choices. They might be right, they might be wrong. We're not judging, I mean, at least the writer is not judging them. And through that, actually, you see that finally she has to come to an understanding about her own self. And that is what happens in the course of a decade, I think. I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yeah, more or less you did.
And
Yeah.
the other thing that I wanted to say was that when you say Bildungsroman, and that was one of the things that I always wanted to write about, and I want to mention here that, when you look at a Bildungsroman, we always look at the Western male coming of age novel, mostly. Traditionally, we've seen David Copperfield, you've seen James Joyce, which was actually, let me say that it was a big influence, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Because I remember reading it and thinking that portrait of an artist as a young man is fine, but where is the woman? Back then. And then I remember reading Elena Ferrante, when I read Elena Ferrante, and I thought that, oh my God, this is a story, like there's a woman, she is young, she's coming of age, and there's the story of Naples. And then I started thinking that why don't we have these stories in India? So I think the Bildungsroman form has emerged quite a bit, even though we don't see many first-person female voices who are moving across a decade with their choices, with their anxieties, with their wrong choices, with their moralities. So I just felt the need that needs representation at some point. And it's also like an urban middle class person. It's not somebody in the village coming to a city. It's about life in the city, which is very specific and specific and universal at the same time. So that is what I wanted.
And in fact, that reference to Elena Ferrante is very interesting because now one sees the echoes. Because one of the things that's very interesting about this book, if you read the descriptions, it's a lot of the focus is on interiority, the internal journey, the relationships, the complexities, the confusions, the desire, the eroticism. There's a lot of that in the book and a lot of emphasis given from the comments on the book on that. But I feel that what is very beautifully woven along with that is a running constant stream of political awareness. And one of the remarkable things about this book is that there is hardly any disturbing issue of today's life and age that most of us live through, just looking at our daily newspapers, our daily news, grappling with, dealing with, that is not in some way dealt with in this book. Whether it's the question of identity, the question of how people are boxed and labeled into identities, very often based on things that they are born as, whether it's caste, whether it's religion, whether it's a question of communities fighting each other, distrust, suspicion, whether it's a question of how women are constantly facing patriarchal power structures in their daily lives, sexual harassment, the kind of entitlement that young boys have and that they employ so easily over young girls who are helpless, and how the young girls are so vulnerable to that. These are things that are coming up all the time. We're facing them, we're seeing them every day. And then there's the question of class. How do you break out of a class into which you've been trapped, even though you're struggling to raise your standard of living to be seen differently? So these are what I say they're political issues because they are part of the larger social structure that we are all living with. And Rupleena, you manage to, without becoming preachy about any of it, you do manage to bring them in. And I was just wondering if you could read a passage. We had talked about one particular passage which does kind of reflect what I've been talking about how you bring that into the story.
Yeah, I'll just...
You want me to hold it for you?
No, it's fine. The secularism is a disease, basically.
That I think would be nice. And you can just explain the context a little. Even the way campuses are changing, the bit that she's going to read right now is reflects that kind of, again, things that we have been hearing people talk about and hearing in our news.
Yeah. So this is essentially midway into the novel, and as I said, the protagonist is a young English teacher and temporary teacher, and this is a moment when, and this is December 2015 Delhi. So it's a moment when there are things happening in the city, and that sort of suddenly interrupts into her classroom. So basically, there's this inside outside, as Anjum nicely explained, which is when she's a part of her psyche is also observing things which are happening outside. And this is the time when it actually interrupts and gets into the classroom, into her real life. And I think from this point, I guess the book gets darker. I think it's like the cloud of riots sort of come into the book at this point.
There's a wonderful character in the book called Dharam Dev, right?
Dev, yeah.
Dharam Dev, who has who she builds up over the time, over the book, and I don't. Again, we can't go into everything in the book because there are one or two important points I also want her to talk about. But Dharam Dev has not only got a very, very poignant history, but he's also got a very poignant journey. And in the end, the way he comes into fruition as an independent person deals with class, it deals with religious bias and bigotry, it deals with a search for human identity and independence, and it's a very lovely subplot of the book, I would say. One of the things I do want her to talk about, because it's so unusual and rare, and I think a discovery that Rupleena kind of stumbled across when she was working on this book, is that if you noticed when she was reading, there was a reference to Nilokeri and her grandmother's history. And Nilokeri, the term, the name was something I had never come across before. And when I started reading about it in the book, it was very interesting to know that something like this had actually been part of our history and we know nothing about it. Can you share a little bit of that with us, please?
Yeah, sure. So actually this was Nilokeri is this place which is near Karnal, and very recently when all these flyovers have been built, and it's actually got a board which is as recent as, so from Delhi to Chandigarh near Karnal, there's a small little place called Nilokeri. And now there are of course boards, but back like as of 2 years old, but back then, earlier there was no mention. So what happened was, I think, I don't remember the context, but I think it was a part of another novel that I was thinking of writing, that my father told me the story of his aunt, who was an art teacher and who actually was in Shantiniketan, and she went and started living in Nilokeri, which is in Karnal, where there was a project, which was the Nilokeri project, started by Mr. I think S.K. Dey was the Union Rural Minister in 1950. I think he became the minister, and this is the time when India had just become independent. So 1948, what they did was like they tried to make this rehabilitation project and a village which is near Karnal, and it was very symbolic because that area is Kurukshetra. So it was like the symbolic land, where all the refugees from West Pakistan would come and settle, and there would be a community project. So there, the idea was that there would be vocational training. It's also a dairy area. Karnal is Karnal Dairy later. Green Revolution also comes, much later, of course. So the point was that in 1948, Mr. S.K. Dey, because again Bengali, so a lot of people from Calcutta and Shantiniketan in fact went to Nilokeri to live there for a few years. The project was a failure because what happened was like the vocational training, and if you see Nilokeri, it's like it's middle of nowhere. It's like this fields and open spaces, and there could not have been a progressive community that was imagined by Nehru and Mr. S.K. Dey, I think. And as a result, so a lot of people who went there for vocational training, be it sewing, embroidery, art, to in a way help the refugees, come in terms with their life, sort of stayed there for 2-3 years and then they went off to Delhi. So this story somehow, and when he told me the story, that it was mentioned in passing to me, and then of course I probed, and then I got to know that this particular aunt, who I had also known all my life, had lived this 5 years in Nilokari all alone as a single woman, and she was not married or any of, and she just went from Shantiniketan as a group of people who were art teachers who went from Shantiniketan to Nilokari, like so far away back then. I mean, imagine taking the train, going from Calcutta to Delhi and then further ahead. So this story, I had to use it, and which is why I used the story. And when I put it, I realized that there was no mention, like with all the partition memoirs, you have, like even all those very, very well-known books, and nobody had mentioned Nilokari. Somehow it was just lost in history. And that's how, I wanted to keep it. And my earlier idea was to put it in another novel, which will be like the, like a partition novel moving from, Muzaffarpur to Calcutta to Delhi. But at the same time, I thought that, no, I mean, the moment is here and now with the grandmother's story, and I kept this backstory there. So yeah, so that was the Nilokari. So I mean, I was surprised that everybody said that, but we've never heard of Nilokari before. And then they started researching and they met people and archives and all that, but yeah. So that was something which I had stumbled upon.
So you have these unusual moments in history where, for example, as she talks about her aunt, a woman who just went there to be an art teacher to this group of refugees and create a life for herself there, completely at odds with the usual trajectory of what a woman from her kind of Bhadra background, middle class, upper middle class, cultured Bengali woman would do. And this is just one example of what I noticed in the book is that there is a lot of, very subtle and very sort of nuanced ways of bringing in women's stories and how women's lives are played out due to societal pressures, which Rupleena talks about. She takes up motherhood in a very interesting way, very different understanding of being a mother, a woman's relationship with her own body, with desire. She talks about faithfulness within a marriage, the relationships. She looks at and sort of tries to understand a lot of very conventional ideas, which are what people take for granted, and tries to investigate them and see from a different point of view whether they really stand up, or how life would be if one wasn't just automatically accepting that these are the ways in which one is meant to live. So these were some of the things that I found very. There is also that story of a very young adolescent girl facing sexual harassment and abuse of a friend, and how she tries to deal with it and what happens to her. So, and the vulnerability of very young girls and women who have no support at all when they're trying to deal with these, very, very brutal kind of assaults on their own self, their own dignity and their sense of self. So these are sort of, the book is kind of layered with a lot of these different approaches and different, and so it's a book in which you end up thinking a lot, because about things which, as I said, you very often just end up taking for granted as part of ordinary life. But it does make you think, and I'd like to congratulate you on that, because I think that it's it's a book that finally, like the protagonist, you end up in a different place from when you began, because you're sort of thinking of things along the way. Is there any particular aspect of the book that you would like to share with them before we start, open it up for questions?
I think, yeah, well, I mean, you actually said it so beautifully, so I don't have much more to say, I think. But one thing that I must say is that I thought a lot about desire, and not just women's desire. In general, I felt that there was not much. Desire is a very strange sort of a, I don't know, very contentious subject, right? I mean, it's so complicated. Desire is linked with love. It's linked with longing. It's linked with betrayal. I mean, the moment there's desire, there's betrayal. I think, if you ask me. And not just sexual desire, but all kinds of desire. Desire to be someone who you're not, desire to escape out of conventional boxes. So that is something which I really wanted to write about. And I must also mention some of the, because obviously, like, I felt that when I was reading this writer called Rachel Cusk, and I must mention Rachel Cusk, I must mention Sheila Haiti, and Deborah Levy, because these are some of my very favorite writers. And I remember reading them, and in Rachel Cusk, it's a story about this young professor who goes to Athens, and nothing really happens. Goes to Athens and he's observing, and I felt that, but why don't we have this story about young, teacher, writer, artist who's a woman who's in the city, who's negotiating desire. And the moment you put it in India, you also negotiate class and you also negotiate conflict. And that is something which I thought I really wanted to do in a book, in my book, in the book that I would write. And it's something that I felt was underrepresented. And I say this because I also teach literature. So I always felt that teaching literature itself is something which gives you this amazing perspective. You come with a text in your classroom. Now you're talking about a text which is like, very interesting and modern, Second World War, First World War, modern city, Paris and London. And here you are in a classroom where there's no power for like 8 hours and you're sweating and you're talking about the summer and the winter there. So to me, that dichotomy was very important. So that had to be linked to a story which is also about desire, also about class. So it just had to come together. There was no other choice, but to combine all of these things. So that's just something that I wanted to add, I think.
Yeah. To the book. Yes, and as returning to the title of this talk, Seasons of Love, Longing and Politics, very much about desire. And I think that just run like a very steady stream through the book. So I hope that this has left you with a desire to immediately start reading the book and for yourself.